Hello, sixth graders. Your wacky math teacher, Mrs. Parsons, here today on Wednesday, November the 11th. And I'm going to do a small video for you today about multiplying decimals. If you recall, this week we reviewed the process of what is a decimal? How do we know its place value? Do we know its parts of a whole? Can we add and subtract those things? And now we're going to try multiplying them. And again, it is a review. You've done this before, the sixth grade, but I'm just going to give you a few of my insights, maybe my tips that might make you think, I understand why we do that now, maybe just a little bit more than I did before. So hopefully it'll be a small video, but I do want to make sure that I give you some very important tips so that you maybe remember why and how you multiply decimals the way you do, okay? So we are going to work with multiplying decimals. The first I'm going to write up in big letters, don't line up the decimals. Don't do that, sixth graders. Multiplying decimals is not the same as adding and subtracting them. Remember, in my last video, I talked about adding and subtracting decimals, all those lovely symbols, adding and subtracting, it's a little bit too big there, adding and subtracting decimals, sixth graders, you do that by lining up the decimal. And if you recall, we do that because of the place value. And because they are individual parts. They are individual parts. I have 5 pennies. That's 5 hundredths. This is what 5 hundredths look like. Or that's what 5 hundredths looks like. That's 5 pennies. If I want to give you 17 more pennies, there's 17 more pennies. A dime and 7 pennies, or 17 pennies. If I want to put those things together, sixth graders, I'm going to put 5 individual pennies together with 17 individual pennies. That is why we line up the decimal. So that I have 7 and 5, which is 12. I regroup, and 1 and 1 is 2. I bring that decimal straight down because I added individual parts. That is adding and subtracting decimals, individual parts. Multiplying decimals, on the other hand, sixth graders, is not individual parts. Multiplying decimals is using, big word, groups. I'm using groups, so that is why I'm not going to line up the decimal when I multiply decimals. I'm not going to line them up because I'm not doing individual parts when I add and subtract. When I multiply, I'm creating groups of those things. So I'm going to go back to those 5 pennies I had. Here are those 5 pennies. And what happens if I want to give 5 pennies to 17 of my students? How many pennies am I going to give to my students? Well, in your head, you know that multiplication really is a repeated addition process. So you can do this. Ready? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, 85, 90. And I'll keep adding those 5 pennies until I've done it 17 times. Or if I don't want to stand here all day being a silly Billy in front of my math students, I'll say, instead of counting by 5s, I'll multiply that and do it quicker. So I want to multiply my 5 pennies by 17. Well, sixth graders, when I think about multiplying, don't I just line up numbers? I just line them up and I multiply. It's no different when you do decimals. Just line up the numbers. Don't think about the decimal till the end. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply this. Now, if this is Mrs. P, for real, I wouldn't write my problem like this. Even though they have the same amount of numbers, the same digits, they look like they're the same length, two numbers, I still wouldn't write it like that because of that zero. I don't like the zero being in a corner where I have to cross multiply. So I would rewrite this for myself as 17 times 5 pennies times 5 hundredths. And now that zero's in the corner, and I know it's always going to create zeros, so it doesn't make Mrs. P feel all ughy in math. You should always, sixth graders, always make sure you're putting that largest number, whether it is a large number or whether it looks like a larger number. You should always put it at the top, okay? Unless it tells you not to. 2 times it'll tell you not to. Division and subtraction. Addition and multiplication, always put the larger number on the top. It just helps you. When it's division and subtraction, you can't switch the numbers around. You got to do what they tell you. If they told me 6 divided by 8, even though that's going to give me a really wonky number as a decimal, and usually a negative number, I don't want to switch them around because they told me to do 6 divided by 8. But when I add and when I multiply, it just helps you, sixth graders, to put the larger number on top. It just does, especially when you're doing your cross place value for multiplying. So I've got 17 students. I want to give them each 5 pennies. I want to know how many pennies I gave them all together. I could count by 5s until I get to 17, but that's going to take me a bit. So I know multiplication is the same process as addition, only I can do it quicker because I don't have to do every repeated step. I can just do it all in one step. So I'm going to go 5 times 7, which is 35. I'm going to regroup my 3, and 5 times 1 is 5, plus 3 is 8. I can go ahead and do these zeros if I want, always putting a placeholder. I'm now going over one place value, so I always have to put a placeholder in the position I've already used. Put that placeholder, and then of course 0 times 7 is 0, and 0 times 1, 0 times 1, 0 times 1, eventually I'll get it out right, is 0. I'm now going to do what I would do in normal multiplication of whole numbers. I'm going to add those rows of place value up. I'm going to say it's 5, 8, and 0. And since I didn't line up the decimal in the opening of the problem, I'm not just going to bring down the decimal in the end of the problem. What I'm going to do, sixth graders, and this is the difference between adding and subtracting, another difference, adding and subtracting individual parts. Multiplying decimals are groups. Don't line up the decimals. I'm not putting pieces together. I'm making groups of pieces. So line them up, adding, subtracting. Don't line them up with multiplying. Don't line them up, okay? Because I'm creating groups. Add, subtract, line up. Multiplying, don't line them up. Multiply your numbers and then place your decimal in its position. And the way we do that, sixth graders, is we always look to the end of our number. If this did not have a decimal in it at all, it would be the number 85. Every whole number has a decimal in it. Where's it at? At the end. Every whole number has a decimal, sixth graders. I'm going to repeat that. Where's it at? At the end. So if I have the number 18, there is a decimal in there. It's right there at the end. There's no parts behind it, but I could make parts if I wanted to. And that's why the decimal is always at the end. The number 56, it has a decimal in it. It's right there at the end. There again are no parts, but I could make parts behind it if I wanted to. So the decimal always goes at the end of a whole number. So when we're multiplying decimals, the decimal always starts at the end of the number. But I know it's not a whole number, sixth graders, because I was multiplying parts. I'm creating groups. And in this case, I'm creating 17 groups of 5 pennies. And I want to know how many pennies I gave out. So I put my decimal at the end. I look to see how many decimals are in my problem. And this is a nice one because there's only one decimal. I look to see how many spots are behind that decimal. There's 2. And then I move my decimal from the end to the left twice. I move it to the left because if you see this, 6th graders, I now have parts. I don't have a whole number anymore. It's not the number 85. Instead, now it's 85 hundredths. So if I wanted to give out 5 pennies to 17 students, I would be giving out 85 hundredths, or 85 out of 100 pennies. I gave out 85 pennies to my 17 students. And that is how we multiply decimals. Now, that was by a whole number. So I want to make another sheet for you 6th graders that talks about what if I have a decimal by a decimal. So I'm going to do both of those again. I'm going to say I've got, what was my last one? 5 hundredths. I'm going to say I have 68 thousandths, and I want to give that 68 thousandths a lot of Abraham Lincoln's noses, if you remember me talking about that from your earlier video. I've got 68 thousandths, and I want to, I'm going to say I'm going to go 68 thousandths. Maybe I want to dig something 68 thousandths of an inch into the ground or something like that. I want 68 thousandths of something, and I want it 5 times. I want to do it 5 times. So I want to multiply it times 5. Again, I write it vertically so that you'll see what you do when you write it horizontally. Again, 6th graders, although this has a 0 in it this time, I'm going to leave it on the top. Why? Because it just looks bigger because it has more numbers in it. If this doesn't look bigger, then I'll put it on the bottom. But I always look for the size, and that means the length of the number, not how much value it has, but how big it looks in digits. So I'm going to put the 68 thousandths right there, and I'm going to put the 5 right under the 8, because there is no decimal in my whole number of 5. Well, there is, but it's back here. I can pretend and put it there. I'm going to not line them up. I'm just going to line up the numbers as I come to them, coming from the right to the left, okay? Every number needs to be lined up as I'm coming from the right to the left. And then I'm just going to look at that like I'm multiplying 68 times 5. And I'm going to go 5 times 8 is 40. Regroup my 4. 5 times 6 is 30. Plus 4 is 34. I'm going to regroup my 3. 5 times 0 is 0. But I'm going to add in the 3 I regrouped. And if I was just doing a standard multiplication problem with whole numbers, 68 times 5. 6th graders, that's 340. But I've added a decimal to that problem. So now, instead of being 340 wholes, I know I have parts because that decimal tells me I do. So I'm going to look and see how many decimals I have. I've got 1. I'm going to look to see how many spots I have behind it. I've got 3. And I'm going to move my decimal from the end of my number over 3 times. And 6th graders, this should make sense because, one, if you go, well, it's not a bigger number. That's what kids usually ask. It didn't make a bigger number. Well, it won't. It's not always going to make a bigger number, 6th graders, because I'm using parts. But it is a bigger number in how many parts there are. Here there are only 68 thousandths. Now there's 340 thousandths. It's still small parts, but there's more of them. So actually it did make a larger number, but not larger to you as in, well, there's no holes. Well, there's no holes yet. You got to wait. You're going to have to get more than 5 groups of them to make that look bigger. But I am going to go ahead and move that decimal over. Even if it looks like, well, that didn't make anything bigger. It did make the number bigger. It made more parts of a thousandth. So I move it over, and 68 thousandths times 5. If I put 68 thousandths in 5 groups, I get 340 thousandths. And the reason I think that should make sense, 6th graders, is if you look at that and you look at this, we're in the same place value. We ended on thousands here. Now I'm ending on thousands here. You should end in that same spot when there's only one decimal in your problem. Now that's different, sixth graders, if I have two decimals, and I want to tell you about that. So now I'm going to say I have 71 hundredths times, I'll do an easy one, times 3 tenths, okay? 71 hundredths times 3 tenths. I'm again going to put my larger number on top, so it's 71 hundredths. I'm going to multiply it by 3 tenths. Again, I'm lining up my numbers here, not the decimals. Why? Because I'm not adding 71 hundredths and 3 tenths. I'm not adding them together. They're not individual parts. I'm grouping 71 hundredths into 3 groups. I want 71 hundredths 3 times using tenths. I'm going to put them in tenths by that hundredths. So that means putting the parts into more parts. So I'm going to then multiply this, sixth graders, and I'm just going to look at it like it's 71 times 3, and that is 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 7 is 21. If it was whole numbers, it'd be 213. Well, if I come over here and multiply 71 hundredths times 3 tenths, it's going to be 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 7 is 21. It's still 213, sixth graders, but I know it's not going to stay that whole number because those decimals right there tell me I'm putting it into parts. Now, here's the part that Mrs. P wants to really inform you about, which some teachers don't inform you about, so that you'll really understand why you move this decimal, okay? If I go to the standard information people tell you or teachers tell you, you would say count the decimals. 1, 2 decimals. How many spots are behind those decimals? 1, 2, and 1. How many spots is that in all? 3. You could only have 1 decimal in your answer, sixth graders. In your product, you can only have 1 decimal, ever. You're not going to put more than 1 decimal, and I'm going to show you why. So you've got 71 hundredths times 3 tenths. You see there's 2 decimals. You see there's 3 spots because 2 and 1 is 3. So there's 3 spots behind the decimal now. I always start at the end of my whole number, and I go over 1, 2, 3. So it says, sixth graders, if I multiply 71 hundredths times 3 tenths, I'm going to get 213 thousandths. Now, here's the part. Sixth graders, if you wonder, well, why is that? Because now it's got 3 numbers. That only had 2, that only had 1, and this had 3. Sixth graders, if you think about the number hundredths, and you multiply it by the number tenths, what would you get? 0, 0, 0. Add your placeholder. 1 times 0 is 0. 1 times 0 is 0. 1 times 1 is 1. I add those together. And what number do I come up with? Oh, yeah, the thousandths. The thousandth place. So that is why when we say there's 1 decimal, there's another decimal, 2 spots, 3 spots, it's because hundredths times thousandths, and I said that wrong, hundredths times tenths give me thousandths. Hundredths times tenths give me thousandths. So that is why my answer, sixth graders, is 213 thousandths, because I've multiplied parts by parts. So now, that's the end of this video again today, sixth graders. Getting good at this 20-minute video business. Again, questions. Ask me. I'm always here. Remember, important information. Multiplying decimals, don't line up those decimals because you are multiplying parts together that create groups, not individual things like when you're adding and subtracting. You're grouping things with that multiplication of decimals. So don't line up your decimals, sixth graders. You're going to count them and then move it when you are all finished by its place value. That's it for today. I'll see you again on Thursday. I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday. Miss you guys and hope you're having a great day. Have a wonderful Wednesday.